share with you this morning. Matt kicked off this series a couple of weeks ago, and then Dave spoke last week on caring for your soul by paying attention. But I got my dates muddled up. So we're going back a few verses, okay, from where we were last week, before Moses encountered God at the burning bush. So we find Moses having shown his dark side. Mark Twain said this, that everyone is a moon and has a dark side which he never shows to anyone, or he don't want to show to anyone. But Moses's, that's tricky to say, Moses's had been revealed. You try that. I realised that when I'd only said it in my head until this morning, and I thought that's quite tricky to say. But Moses's had been revealed. And when he knew that it had been discovered, he ran. He ran to Midian, which is east of Egypt, across the Sinai Peninsula. And there is nothing between Egypt and Midian. Hot, arid, dry desert. That's all there is. He fled to the desert, and in a matter of a couple of days, he went from being an heir to the throne to a fugitive because of his failure. 200 plus miles of desert, I'm sure, gives a person plenty of time to think. I don't know if you can even imagine what Moses was thinking as he crossed that dry, barren land. We probably don't think too much about travelling 200 miles. We just hop in a car and there we are. This is a map of 200-mile radius from Bury St Edmunds. So within a few hours, we can get them in 200 miles. This is how far we can get from Bury St Edmunds. We wouldn't think anything of it. But for Moses, this was perhaps a 2-week, if he was maybe got a lift on a camel, or on foot, maybe even longer. Moses had fallen far and fallen fast, hadn't he? But then we start to see God's grace at work. He sat down by a well. The well in the middle of the desert became this open door that God had provided for Moses' future. I keep saying that, Moses's. I mean, it's tricky to say, but I'm going to say it a lot. Moses' future. It was at the well that his thirst was quenched, and then the next phase of God's plan starts. Moses just wanted a drink, but God had much more in store than that. He wanted to care for this alienated man, both physically and for his soul. He wanted to restore him. He wanted to train him. He wanted to prepare him. You know, God will always provide a well. Know that this morning. However isolated or alienated or alone or confused you may feel, look up, because there'll be a well. And actually, if you think of it, Jesus is our well, isn't he? A well in the desert will refresh, it will give a new start, it will save someone's life. Isn't that what Jesus does? Jesus is our well in the desert. This well in the desert would refresh him. But to start with, he gets to the well, and what he sees is the same injustice that he's just come from in Egypt. He must have thought, what is going on? This is following me around. I'm seeing injustice everywhere. But this is the start of his redemption. Because these 7 shepherd girls trying to water their sheep, and then we have these bullies, these people that won't let them water their sheep, and Moses saw it. And Moses knew it wasn't right. And Moses is our man of action. He had to intervene, just like he did with the Egyptian in Egypt. But this time was going to be different. There was no killing. This was standing up to what was not right. This was serving his fellow man. I'm sure you all agree with me that when we read the news or watch the news, that our world is full of injustice, isn't it? Doesn't it tear at your soul? It tears at my soul. It upsets me, it frustrates me. And if we are ever going to live in the way God intended, we have to start living in the way God intended. And he doesn't do that sort of in a judicial decree. He does it lovingly and personally and ministering to each of us individually, encouraging us to do the right thing. And that soft spot in Moses' heart that was so touched by what was happening to his people is also touched then by these 7 helpless ladies at the well. These 7 young ladies would take Moses to their father Jethro would become his father-in-law, and he would become a shepherd, and then as a shepherd he would eventually encounter God on the mountain, and he would hear God's voice calling him to return to Egypt and to rescue the nation of Israel. But there is much to happen between the well and returning to Egypt. I don't know if you feel this morning you've ever felt that you live in a desert of failure. The truth is that we often have to cross a desert of failure to be able to start again. It's in that crossing the desert that we have time to reflect. We have time to almost have a safe place to sort of revisit ourselves. Allows us to reflect on our mistakes and our failures, but also allows us to look forward. The time in the desert becomes the beginning of God's restoration. As Matt said a couple of weeks ago, it's in the desert that God does his work. How many of those great biblical figures all had times in a desert? They weren't abandoned in the desert. That's where God did his work with them. And do you know what? You have to go to a desert to find a well and know that that's what you need. So if you feel in a desert this morning, please be reassured. God has placed a well of refreshing, and that well is an open door that God will use for our restoration and our redemption, just like it was for Moses. Do you remember Jesus himself, when he was passing through Samaria, stopped at a well to get a drink of water, and there he encountered a woman, and he spoke to her, and they talked about water. Jesus talked to her about living water. He said to her, "You will drink the water from this well and get thirsty again." And then he said, "But the water I give them takes away thirst altogether. It becomes a perpetual spring within them, giving them eternal life." Perhaps you're here this morning and you feel that you have failed at something. Maybe your Christian life, maybe your witness, or whatever it is. But there's something that's forced you into this desert of self-condemnation and alienation. You feel alone. Just look up this morning. Look up and see the well that God has put there. See Jesus and have your thirst quenched. When failure forces us to flee, we find forgiveness and freedom when we discover the well of God's grace in Jesus. So find this refreshment this morning. Be refreshed this morning as God maybe begins a transformation process in your life and is preparing you for something ahead. Because what Moses finds at this well is a new start. He finds peace for his aching soul. You know, Moses is welcomed in by Jethro. Did you see in the reading? Jethro's like, "Why did you leave him there? Go and get him. You know, we probably need something to eat." Jethro was hospitable and warm. He was completely non-judgmental. He didn't reject this man because he was different. And he gave Moses opportunity and space to care for his soul. So Moses settles in Midian. And life must have seemed quite sedate compared to what he'd come from. But that is just what Moses needed. Because Moses was no longer a man of action. He was no longer mighty in word. He was no longer royalty. And he no longer thought of himself as deliverer of his people. And what he was Moses, the recovering failure. That's what he was. And he's on the run. And he is entering, unbeknown to him, a second phase of training in this God's graduation school of learning. You may be inclined to think of these years as wasted years for Moses. All he's really doing is just guiding a few sheep around for his nomadic father-in-law and family across the desert. That appears to be all that's happening, but it isn't. Because God uses this time, the guiding hand of the isolation of the desert and the wisdom of Jethro, to prepare Moses for what lies ahead. Jethro was warm, simple hospitality helped this former prince of Egypt emerge from his shell of grief and self-pity. He entered into a world of preparation, a world designed by God to train him for the time when he would return to Egypt for a far greater purpose. God is going to use the isolation of the desert to work on the character of the man he was going to use. Moses had learned loads in Egypt. He was well educated, but unselfishness, hospitality, wisdom, kindness, he didn't learn any of them. This he learned from Jethro and his family. In a commentary, I read this. These were the years in which his rough edges were blasted by sand and made smooth. The literal blast of the Sinai sand refined the character of a man God was going to use. There he learned to pray, and he learned the value of solitude. There, starting with a few sheep and goats, he learned the principles of shepherding, of leadership. God often uses isolation and pain to get our attention in ways success never can. He uses life's pain to teach us, to mould us, to make us useful. The pain isn't for nothing. God will use it for his glory. What an incredible time this was for Moses. The Egyptians worshipped many gods, two of them here, Re and Osiris. And Moses was exposed to all these different gods when he was in Egypt. But he also had the stories that his mother would tell him about the God of Abraham. And God led him to Jethro, whose name Ruel means friend of God. You know, none of these things are happening by chance. God led him to a man whose name meant friend of God, not friend of Osiris, not friend of Ra, nothing. He led him to a friend of God. And at the beginning of the story, Moses is running for his life. No more the comforts of the palace, no more servants to call upon, armies to command. He's alone and alienated, probably for the first time in his life. And at this point, he doesn't have anything much to count on. Maybe he doesn't even know where his next meal will come from. Jethro's hospitality is welcome, and he finds himself in a modest tent, surrounded by modest ways. But in this home, he finds support and acceptance and love. He gets married and raises a family. It's interesting, Moses has two sons. It's quite interesting when you look at the names of Moses' sons. Gershom means a foreigner in a foreign land. This is how this man felt. He had no sense of home. And it seems sad when we think that. But actually, God is preparing him for another 40 years of not having a home. His second son, Eleazar, says his actual name means, my father's God was my helper. But then Moses goes on to say, he saved me from the sword of Pharaoh. So here he is, he's remembering his father's God. Perhaps not quite yet his God, but he remembers this God that saved him from Pharaoh. He maybe thinks that he's going to live out the rest of his life as a simple shepherd amongst nomads, but we know God has other plans. But when we see that verse, God heard the groaning and God remembered the covenant with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. The word remember doesn't mean that God forgot. You know, it was not like us, you know, or me. Let me say me then. When I walk into a room and go, yeah, why did I come in here? And where are my glasses? You know, I do that all the time. God hadn't forgotten anything. This isn't God forgetting. This is God being ready to act. Moses is almost finished his training. He's almost finished, and he's ready to fulfill his destiny. You know, sometimes I think God allows us to go through experiences to humble us. Moses had learned to live a life of hardship so that he would be able to endure what was to come. God knows what's best for us and the things that we will have to face that we don't know of. Moses had been trained in the Egyptian way and apparently had lived this lifestyle of a royal, the elite. And now we read Moses was content to dwell with the man. Moses continued to live in Midian. He now lived as a shepherd. He needed to get used to it. He was going to have another 40 years of it. In Acts 7:22 we read that Moses was educated in all the wisdom of the Egyptians and was powerful in speech and action. Not anymore he wasn't. Not anymore he wasn't. This is why God needed to train him. So why did God spend decades training Moses? It was important for Moses to acquire the necessary experience. He needed how to learn to live practically, patiently and passionately again. He needed to learn skills of guiding, of leading, of shepherding. One day he was going to have to shepherd 100,000 plus people, but God was starting him gently with just a few sheep and goats. Sheep and goats are notoriously bad, aren't they, at wandering off. But you know what? They will follow their shepherd. I mean, I'm going to say you can't write this stuff, but you can't write this stuff, can you? I know it's in the Bible. But when you just imagine, when you just see it and think, God is so amazing that with a few sheep and goats that were rowdy and a bit numpty and a bit wandering off and doing their own thing, he had to learn how to deal with them before he could learn how to deal with it on a much larger scale. So here he is with his sheep. To his credit, Moses was a great success in the practical realm of family life. He was a good father, a good son-in-law, a good husband. And they are skills he needed to learn as well. Do you know there are lots of 40s in this story and in the story of Moses, in total. The word 40 appears 157 times in the Bible. It normally symbolizes a period of testing or a trial or a probationary period, but it can also symbolize a generation. Moses' life can be divided into 3 blocks of 40. Absolutely 3 blocks of 40. I just love how this all fits together. So Moses learned the patience of dwelling as an alien in a foreign land. He remained 40 years in the wilderness of Midian. And then, after 40 years had passed, an angel appeared to Moses in the flames of a burning bush in the desert near Mount Sinai. Bang! It's revealed to him. The simplicity of it, the perfection of it, is now revealed to him. And all that had happened was in preparation for the 40 years he will now spend in Sinai. God has a reason and an occasion for everything. 40 years was time enough for Moses to get over the past. It was time enough to get rid of his baggage. It was time enough to restore and care for this man's soul. And now he was ready. God said, "You're ready to get on with what I've got planned for you." When we feel alienated and in a desert of confusion, hurt, upset, lonely, and your soul aches, look up, because there is a well. And just sit by it. Just sit by it. Drink it in. Have your thirst quenched and your soul cared for. God is able to do that for us, just like he did for Moses. There are no coincidences in that story. I love how amazing it is the whole way through. How perfectly God puts things together. I don't know why I'm surprised how perfectly God puts things together. I'm not. But sometimes it just makes you think, wow, how perfectly. There's a well for us this morning. From the chaos of Egypt, all that had happened, he runs, and then he sits by a well. And God says, right where I want you to be. Now let's get started. Let's get started. So this morning, friends, sit by the well. And like Moses, maybe we have to get into our minds that sometimes we need to lie flat before we can stand tall. And it's in that lying flat in the desert that God works on us, so that when we stand tall, and we stand in his will to do what he wants us to do. So we're going to sing again before we take communion. Let's just pray, shall we? Lord God, we thank you for this incredible story of Moses. Thank you that when he felt he was in just a desert of failure and probably where he was going to die, there was the well. Lord God, I pray this morning that you will help us look up and see the well that you have put for us this morning. That you will restore and care for our souls this morning as we draw near to you.